So now this panel is about state secularism as the basis of democracy and human rights. That's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I will admit my bias right out from the gate, which is that I'm an enormous secularist. I believe in secularism. If it's possible to believe in it over 100%, then I believe in it over 100%. I'm curious, obviously, about the real world, examples of things that have happened, and we're going to discuss here how to get secularism back in some places, how to introduce secularism in some countries. So I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation, and we've got at least two great people here to talk about it. First, let me introduce Hina Jilani. She's a renowned Pakistani human rights lawyer and founding member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. So Hina's going to do a little bit of introduction and speech, and then so will our other panelists, and then we'll all start to discuss together.
I have a little bit of a difficulty with the topic that I have been given to speak about. I don't think first and primarily of secularism as being the basis of democracy. For me, what is important is what are the minimal institutional and political requirements that a polity must satisfy before it can be called a democracy. And there, in that context, we weigh the importance of secular basis for statehood in any country. So the primary concern is what weakens democracy and what strengthens it. So I look at secularism or a secular polity as part of the assessment of democracy in any country. So let me say, for instance, what do I expect of democracy? Number one, of course, embracing diversity and respecting pluralism and accommodating pluralism. Number two, recognition that fundamental freedoms and universal human rights have to be respected in the first place. And does a secular context help us to determine whether human rights, rule of law, communal harmony can be accommodated in a secular society? It is in this context that I want to look at this. Now, the Constitution has a function. The Constitution has the function of determining how to contextualize the relationship between the state and religion in order that fundamental principles of participation by everyone are fulfilled in the guarantees that the Constitution gives to the citizen. So I don't see my country or my relationship with my country as a believer. I want to be a citizen. Are we believers or are we citizens? So as citizens, we have a certain way of looking at what the state gives us when we surrender so much to the state in terms of enhancing its powers, legitimate powers. The individual does surrender in many ways to the state in that context. I want to talk about Pakistan a little bit, if you will allow, Cenk, because that's a textbook example of where neither secularism nor religiosity has served the state has allowed the state to serve its citizens. Now let's look at what, and I think we have some young friends here from India who are too young to understand the history of India and Pakistan division. But why did India become a secular state? And why did Pakistan choose to give itself the identity of religion? When Pakistan was divided from India in 1947, we have to understand why India at that point took the option of making sure that everybody is reassured in that state of equality, of the right to participate, the guarantees against discrimination, where India, of course, is a much more diverse, religiously diverse country than Pakistan is. Pakistan is a very diverse country in terms of ethnicity, language, etc. But it's a very, it has a majority Muslim population. We are 96% Muslims. So the minorities are very small. But to the human rights mind and those that are defending fundamental freedoms, even one person is important. So where the majoritarian thinking compels the state to take on a religious identity, you are neglecting a minority and telling them this state is ours and you are only here as a concession that we give you, and not necessarily because you are respected as a full citizen. India took that option, but that experiment failed. Why? Because I think the democratic values do not necessarily come from secularism. The statement that we are secular alone will not give you what you need in order to ensure that you celebrate the diversity and pluralism that your population demonstrates. Now, Pakistan, for instance, when we became independent, the founding father of that country said in his first speech in the Constituent Assembly on the 11th of August 1948, he said, "We are not Muslims or Hindus or Christians. We are all Pakistanis. And there is full freedom. You can go to your temples and your mosques and everything." So the idea in the founder's mind was very different from what his population was conditioned to expect. So all these symbolisms that people brought in to make sure that we as a state can sustain ourselves, what was happening? There was enforced homogeneity. This is a kind of enforced unity that the state decided to impose on a very disparate, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilinguistic population. So we are all brothers in Islam. So we are an Islamic state. Now that experiment failed as well. And the biggest evidence of that is the creation of Bangladesh. We were obviously not all brothers in Islam, because as a nation state, everybody has an interest. So there is identity, a perception or reality of deprivation of rights, of the inability to fully participate, be given the kind of status that everybody else enjoys. That was much more powerful than any kind of a perception of who you are in terms of religion. Pakistan's original constitution in 1956 did not say that Pakistan is an Islamic state. It was subsequently, and interestingly enough, when there were illegitimate military regimes in power, that the constitution that came into being as a result of the will of a dictator that gave the state an Islamic identity. Despite that, between the period 1962 to 1973, when our permanent constitution then came into being after one of the first elections in Pakistan, the whole concept of Islamic State was carried forward. At the same time, this constitution in 1973 also spelled out all the fundamental freedoms, especially the freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. everybody had the right to freely profess and practice their religion. That was the preamble of that constitution. What happened to this country? In 1977, we had a military coup again. And this time, the military used Islam in order to legitimize the illegal takeover of the country. And they, of course, executed the popularly elected prime minister at that time. But that was not the only tragedy. The tragedy, again, was that in order to sustain their control, they used fear. And Islamic values, or those that the pseudo-Islamic values, were imposed in order to instill fear. So there were penal laws where all kind of corporal punishment, amputations, stoning to death, and then there were also targeting who they thought were the most weak section of the society, and that's women and the non-Muslim minorities, through these penal laws. Unfortunately, they miscalculated. While the minorities were depressed, women stood up. And if you remember the 1980s, this is the time when Pakistan had become a part of the war in Afghanistan and of what they called Mujahideen fighting against the Russians. And believe me, and I'm not here exaggerating anything, it was the women in Pakistan who made sure that we did not turn into Afghanistan. We stood up and became enemy number one of the military regime. So everything was challenged. And women also understood that women's rights are not going to be promoted in isolation. So they joined the movement for restoration of democracy and challenged the government of the military government who in terms of how they can manipulate the state in order to create more social divisions and disharmony. Now that's a long time ago, decades ago, but we are seeing the consequences of it today. It's a divided nation. It's a nation where there is a sense of deprivation amongst the minority communities. And I tell you that in Pakistan, which was already a vast majority of Muslims in their population, the minority population has declined. People have left that country because of fear, which has been very violent against non-Muslim minorities. There were laws like the blasphemy laws that were adopted in order to persecute as well as prosecute religious minorities. I think I would also clarify here that it's not just religious minorities who have suffered. We are also a very sectarian divided country. So it's a lot of the minority sect, the Shias, for instance, suffered. Also as a country and a parliament, unfortunately, chose to throw a certain community that calls itself Muslim out of the pale of Islam. And they were declared non-Muslims, the Ahmadiyya community. And they are the most hit by the adoption of not just of laws, but also of policies against them. Pakistan's population has now been conditioned to react and be very open to incitement to violence. We have mob lynchings. I don't know whether you remember or not, we've a violent mob lynched and beat to death a Sri Lankan national. My experience of 40 years of legal practice as well as a human rights defender tells me that we have substantial body of material to demonstrate that most of what the blasphemy laws are doing is promoting people to take revenge for personal disputes. in many of these cases, we find that this is the case. And the law itself is so ambiguous and so vague. There is no requirement of intent or mens rea in the law. So it's the subjective understanding of the listener to say this man has committed blasphemy because he doesn't like what that person has said. And the process of prosecution is such that it is weighed against the victim. Many of the lawyers, I myself, have had several attacks against me because I have defended those accused of or falsely accused of blasphemy. But at the same time, I think it's important to understand that this serves a certain group of people. And those groups, or religious lobbyists as we call them, have become so influential without enjoying any mass popularity in the country. We have religious political parties. They have never won the elections and have been extremely marginalized in electoral experiences in Pakistan. But they influence policy because they have, and especially since the 1980s, where madrasas had sponsored by money from the United States, etc., did flourish and became very powerful and were used by the military in order to fulfill a political agenda that they had at that time. Why did the military do this? Why did they adopt Islamization or fake Islamization? Because what they were supporting in Afghanistan, they wanted their population to subscribe to the same rules in order to sustain their power. So it was fear and a pressure. So these are some of the things that convince us that when you give the state a certain identity, you fail to give justice to all. You fail to understand the importance of due process of law. And believe me, this is not what Islam is all about. But at the same time, this is also a very difficult accommodation and management of how a state should manage both religious sentiments, but also its legal obligations by accepting international law. Pakistan's constitution contradicts itself. Mm-hmm. So these are some of the things I think I can say as a preliminary in terms of how democracy and secularism interact.
Okay, I want to challenge you on that a little bit later because I'm a little partial to the U.S. Constitution and how it deals with the issue of secularism, and I think it strikes an interesting balance. But we'll come back to that because that's very interesting. I want to introduce the next panelist here. Moncef Marzouki is a former president of Tunisia, which is amazing.
And of course, we cannot talk about secularism without insisting about its relationship with Islam. 20 years ago, I was invited to talk about human rights and democracy to such a group, mostly Islamist, from a political party named Ennahda. And I began my lecture by saying, look, I want to be frank with you. I am secularist. And I remember that the chair of the session stopped me and addressed it to the audience saying, hey, don't misunderstand him. He's not an atheist. And then I understood the problem, the core of the problem, that for the people, being secularist means being atheist. So afterward, they asked me, well, how could you define secularist? What's to be secularist? I said there was a woman wearing, veil. I said, look at this woman. She's wearing a veil, okay? Now, a secularist state is a state who does not force a woman to wear a veil, nor does it force it to abandon it. This is a secular state. A state, not like Iran, Iran, the Iranian state would force women to wear veil. Well, in Tunisia at that time, in the 90s, the government was extremely harsh on women wearing veils, imposing them to take it off. So this is what I would call a secular state, neutral in matter of religion. And this problem, in fact, I think this problem was a huge problem during all the time we were fighting against dictatorship in the Arab world. Because at the time I used to repeat to everybody that, in fact, the divide is not between secularist and Democrat, and Islamist. In fact, the divide is between pro-democracy and anti-democracy, because this must be very well understood that there were a lot of secularists backing dictatorship. You came back, a lot of Assad in Syria also was secularist party backed by secularists. So forget about the fact that being secularist automatically means Democrat. And on the contrary, you can have now for the moment, when you talk about Islamist political party, in fact, you have a spectrum, a very wide spectrum, where you have fascists, against democracy, where you have central part of the spectrum where can be with democracy. This is what happened in Tunisia. We used to have a political party, named Ennahda, was really involved in promoting democracy. And I remember when we were discussing the constitution, I didn't find any, it was not difficult to convince them that the word Sharia must not be put on the constitution. Because, if you put the word Sharia in the constitution, it means that all your legal system would be based on the religious law. And those Islamists accepted the fact that we will not use Sharia, but we will not use also the word Almania, which means secularism in Arabic, because so we had a deal, they accepted the fact that the law, the roots of the law would be the will of the people and not the Sharia. And we have accepted as secularists not to use the word Almania, but just to use the civil society, to talk about civil society, to the role of law, to talk, etc., about democracy, etc. And now in Syria, they are having the same problem, exactly, because in Syria they are discussing what kind of constitution they would have, and they had exactly the same problem. How to define secularism, how to impose what would be the roots of the basis of the legal system. But I'm afraid that in Syria, I'm not sure that they will reach the same consensus that we have reached in Tunisia. Anyway, I'm not going to talk. I would stop here because I would like to answer your question. But once again, for me, the main divide in the Arab country everywhere is not between religious people and not religious, not between secularists and religious. It's mainly between people who are with democracy and against democracy. And with people backing democracy, you can have religious and you can have non-religious. And backing dictatorship, you can have also people, secularists and religious people. This is the most important divide in politics. You can talk, you can make any kind of all kind of philosophical discussion, but when you deal with political issues, this is the real divide in the Arab world, and I think in Islam, this is my deep conviction. Now, of course, we have to stick to the values of secularism, which means equality, gender equality, religious equality, etc. We have to stick to it. But please forget about the fact that secularist means automatically being Democrat. That is not true. This is my own experience, and I don't think it's really just an Arab or a Muslim issue. I think it's an issue everywhere, even in India, for instance. Mm-hmm. So thank you.
So I wanted to challenge you guys on one thing. So I understand what you're saying, that if just because you're secular doesn't mean you're a democracy. You could argue that Stalin was secular, but certainly not a democracy, the Soviet Union, right? But I would argue that secularism is an essential component of democracy. Because so in the US Constitution, it says two things, not one thing about secularism. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first secular country. So it says, you shall not establish a religion. But it has a second part that is very important, which is that you shall not discriminate against any religion. So if you don't have that second part, maybe it creates some of the issues you guys are talking about. But so what I try to explain to our audience and in any political context and discussion is, I love both of those things. Now, I happen to be a secularist and an atheist, but to me, the second part is so important. I need to protect Christians, and because that's the majority in America, but also Muslims, Jews, etc. Because which sect are we going to go with? It's the same problem that they had in Pakistan. So what I ask people who say, oh no, America's a Christian nation. First of all, that's absurd. It's not remotely true. It's the exact opposite. It's a very secular country. Doesn't mean that the majority isn't Christian. Of course it is. But I say, which sect are we going to go with? Are we going Methodist? Are we going Lutheran? Are we going Southern Baptist? Are we going Pentecostal? Are we all going to get snakes and put it around our necks? If you don't know Pentecostals, it's a form of Christianity where, they speak in gibberish, they play with snakes, often get bit and die, by the way. So which form of Christianity are we going with? If you're a Muslim country, is it Shia, is it Sunni? If you want to protect the Sunnis, you must protect the Shia. If you want to protect the Shia, you must protect the Sunnis. So, we're risking the mics again. Okay. So, to me, if you don't have those protections, it will de facto become whatever the majority religion in that country is. They'll consume the whole government. And a government run in any way, shape, or form by religion is not democracy. It's by definition. So that's why I bring up Israel too, because it's an interesting contradiction. They say, we're a proud democracy. If you ever lived in America, you'll hear this piece of propaganda thousands of times in your life. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. They never say asterisks, except for the 5.5 million people we keep as prisoners who have no rights to vote, no rights to anything, and they're Muslims and we don't care about them and we kill them at will, right? So it's also one of the most authoritarian forms of government in the whole wide world. But then they also say, not only are we the greatest democracy in the world, but we're also a Jewish state. Well, that literally makes no sense at all. So, in America, you're not allowed to question that. That's our religion, is don't question Israel. But if you did, you'd say, what does it mean to be a Jewish state and a democracy? So I open that up for you guys. You don't have to answer that particular question, but how do you keep a democracy if secularism is not one of the foundations, not the only one, but one of the pillars of democracy? Won't whatever religion is the majority consume the state?
Now, I think you're proving my point, actually.
Oh, great.
Don't
I love it.
Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that secularism is useless as a value in any constitution if that is the basic principle on which a relationship between the state and the citizen is constructed. What I'm saying is the primary concern that we should have is whether secularism enhances the values of democracy. Yes, equality, I think it does. Guarantees against discrimination, yes, it does. The right to equal participation in government, yes, it does. But the point is, do we speak secularism as democracy, or do we say that that secularism supports democracy in these particular areas? For instance, I don't think anybody can argue that a democracy cannot forbid peaceful expression. Democracy cannot enforce unity and compliance with religion by force or coercion. Democracy cannot punish or discriminate against people on the basis of their belief. So, what do? I agree to some extent with what Mr. Marzouki has said, and India is a good example of that. It still keeps saying, we are a secular state. But look at what is happening to fundamental freedoms in India. Because of certain interest groups promoting the concept of the other. And that concept catches the population's attention and attracts it because of self-interest. Do you think secularism allowed the whole question of the what's it called? Your lower caste Dalits. The Dalits. Did secularism allow them to have equality in that state?
But
have we protected the vast majority of the minority communities in India? In actual fact, no. Because of the way that politics is conducted, not necessarily because secularism is useless.
But let me push back on that a little bit. So you're saying secularism was not a perfect shield and it didn't work as intended in India. And I understand that, and I think you're absolutely right about that.
I think it needs more than just an expression in a constitution. It needs a commitment to serve democracy better.
But I would argue that that's a bigger endorsement of secularism rather than a smaller one.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I'm not undermining the value of secularism. I'm only saying how the primary way of understanding secularism is to look at democracy first.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. By the way, I should correct myself too. Soviet Union was not secular. It was atheist, and it enforced atheism.
Once again, I define myself as a secularist, but I would like to add one important word: moderate secularist. Moderate secularist. Why? Because I live in France, and I can assure you that the far right in France, they have a new religions. Secularism. Secularism is a religion. And I always say to my Islamist friend, look, there is no contradiction between democracy and Islam because democracy is not religion. So you cannot fight against something which is not religion. But in France, I can assure you once again that I'm extremely astonished by the fact that for the far right, it's really a new religion. And I was talking about the fact that the democratic state wouldn't force women to remove the veil. This is what's happening in France. A lot of regions where you have this phenomena. So you cannot explain this fact if you don't accept that for the far right in French, not all French, of course, but for some segment of the society, it's a real religion, and this religion can be extremely dangerous for freedoms, for the dignity of people, for the equality, etc., etc. So we have to be very. Once again, I feel that I am secularist because I'm not. I don't believe that the constitution, the laws of my country should be based on religions, because this would be extremely dangerous. But once again, I have to warn you that the fact that don't believe first that secularism means always democracy. That's not true, and that also secularism can be extremely dangerous when it comes to be linked with the far right politics. This is what I repeat all the time because this is my political experience every day.
And that's part of why I mentioned the second part of the U.S. Constitution that protects all religion. Because in the U.S., theoretically, you couldn't do the law that France is doing, where that you say you can't wear the veil. Because in the U.S., you protect all religions. And so, and by the way, if you are an atheist, you should love that part of the U.S. Constitution more than anything else. Because you need to protect Christianity and Islam and Judaism, etc., if you want to protect atheists. Because if you allow the discrimination on religion, trust me, atheists are first. Okay, they're going to be discriminated against first, and then it's going to go from there. So that's among the reasons why it's important. Plus, it's true. I think it's also fair and right. I very much disagree with my religious friends and etc. But they have every right to be as religious as they like, as long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else. And they have every right to practice their religion and not have the government enforce it. So now let's go to the core of what we were kind of asked to discuss, which is, assuming that secularism is something positive to drive towards, although not sufficient and not enough to call yourself a democracy, how do we get there? So now I'll introduce a little more about my bias but to get your points of view here. So I think religion appears to be logically incompatible with democracy. I don't mean that religion existing. I just made a big defense of all of the religions existing within democracy. But one religion ruling the country seems by definition to be undemocratic. So, but a lot of nations are that way. Saudi Arabia, Iran, again, I would argue Israel is in that direction, if not completely there. How do we get them back? How do we get them to, because any push for secularism is going to be purposely misinterpreted as a push against Islam or against Judaism or any of these state religions.
Our push is for democracy. Constitutions do spell out fundamental freedoms and human rights, and one of those is the freedom of religion. But the malice comes when you have one religion, as you say, that the state owns and gives it an edge in terms of the accommodation of plurality or other religions. So while my constitution says there shall be no discrimination on the basis of religion, and everyone is free to practice and profess their religion. But what happened? During this particular period of martial law in the 80s, the Constitution's preamble was surreptitiously changed. And while it did said that all citizens, including minorities, are allowed to freely profess and practice their religion, the word freely was removed from the preamble. And that gave the basis for how a non-Muslim acts in a country and how a non-Muslim can be punished for his or her beliefs, because the freely was extracted, which meant that the law could be imposed in order to make sure that they remain within the limits that the unfair laws prescribed. So today, the Ahmadis cannot call their places of worship as mosques. They cannot use Islamic names. They cannot use graveyards that are reserved, except those reserved for these Ahmadis. So these are some of the things that the manipulations that are allowed in an unsecular. And I agree with you that secularism does give that basis for the restraints on the state from interfering. But the state then has to make sure that in the name of democracy, they are preserving and practicing secular values. That's how, the universal human rights are. And I'll tell you, this is an example. What was the dilemma for Muslim women in Pakistan during this period? As women, Muslim women, it was unacceptable what was happening and the kind of principles that were imposed on these women. At the same time, we had to have some basis to construct our relationship with the state and how we are going to see it. So we had to go for the universal values. So we didn't reject religion. What we said is, these are the values that we choose in order to advocate our citizenship rights. And I tell you, in Pakistan, people have this perception that women are suffering. Yes, we still have a long way to go, but we've come a long way because of that strategy. So we don't use the word secular, but in what we wanted and what we expressed we wanted, these were secular values.
You both said something that is interesting to me that I didn't expect. you're both wary of using the word secularism. So is secularism a little bit of a dirty word in Muslim countries or some Muslim countries?
I'm not wary of using it because people think it's a dirty word. I think it's important that we explain to the people in a manner in which they are going to accept and understand better.
This is what I told you at the beginning, that it means atheist, in fact. And this is why I think that if you want to promote democracy in the Muslim and Arab world, I don't know it's the same situation in India or in China, etc. I'm just talking about the Arab world and the Muslim world. If you want to promote democracy, this is what we are doing. The main error, to avoid is to talk about democracy as a religion, as something which would replace Islam. You have to repeat all the time that democracy is just a political system, it's a way of governing, it's a way of promoting freedom, etc. And there's nothing to do against Islam. And this was my way of dealing with this, with the Islamists all the time. And the second point, I think, is we can convert a lot of Islamists to democracy, because forget about the fact that the Islamists are just one movement. In fact, it's in a very, very wide spectrum. And this very wide spectrum, you have people really very tough on religion, they would give you the terrorist trend in Islam, etc. But you have also the central part of the spectrum where really you can have very interesting people, open, and then when you convince them that democracy is not against Islam, democracy is just to promote freedom, because Islamists also were victims of dictatorship. And if you can win this central part of the spectrum, then democracy has a chance. Otherwise, you would have to fight against secularists backing dictatorship and Islamists backing dictatorships. And this would be extremely dangerous, and probably, I wouldn't say that it would be a hopeless case, but I think it would be extremely dangerous. So once again, we have to be very, I would say, forget about the dichotomy, this is Islamic, this is secularist, etc. You have to accept that reality is complex and that the reality is moving all the time. There is a dynamic that change all the time. So we have to be very, very careful using this kind of word in this kind of situation.
Let me also kind of clarify something. I neither undermine the essence of secularism as a basis on which democratic values can be promoted. But I also do not avoid using the word secular. The platform for women that I established in the 1980s, the Women's Action Forum, is the only entity in Pakistan that has a charter which says we are secular and use the word secular.
Yeah. So I think that, so let me try one more thing on secularism. So first of all, I'm going to side note, I don't like the word Islamist. And because it's only applied to Islam, right? Nobody ever says Christianist. Yeah, I'll come to you in one sec. No one ever says Christianist. No one ever says Jewishist. It's not a thing, right? I think we should properly call it Islamic fundamentalism, Jewish fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, right? Because the Jewish fundamentalists, again, in the West Bank are the most extreme fundamentalists potentially in the whole world. And so, but they're never talked about, and it's never the Jewicists that are the problem, right? It's absurd. Hindu fundamentalism, enormous issue in India. That's right. And I'll throw this out there and then I'll take questions and comments. I think that if we flip the frame and we frame it as protecting religion, and you use the two clauses in the U.S. Constitution, doesn't have to be from the U.S. Constitution, don't say U.S., okay? But as a general principle, we protect religion, and one of the ways we protect religion is we don't allow the state to discriminate against any religion, right? All right, yes.
First, thank you for a very interesting panel. I appreciate everything you said. By the way, my name is Moncef Marzouki. First, with regard to what you said about Israel, I'm afraid that the situation is getting much worse now, because in the past, all Israeli political parties adopted the Declaration of Independence, which spoke of the state as being Jewish and democratic. I'm afraid now most of the Israeli political parties don't give a damn about democracy, and they concentrate more on the Jewish aspect of the state. So that's number one. Number two, I will focus basically on the Arab region, which I know, with my apology to our Pakistani expert. And in this regard, I want to register my high respect to President Marzouki and for his historic role, the historic role he played in the Arab Revolution and in the historic transformation that took place in Tunisia. So I'm saying that so there is no any misunderstanding. But in addition to that, I believe that we have a problem. And the problem is not with Islam. The problem is with Islamists.
Yes, of course.
Of course.
Absolutely.
And I agree with him that there are several shades of Islamic parties. And I agree with him also that Al-Nahda are smarter than other Muslim brother parties because Tunisians generally are smart, open-minded, and they are ready to debate and things like that. But the example he gave, I think, I'm not sure, but I think it reflects the desire of Al-Nahda to reach an agreement with Moncef Marzouki. So it was a smart position more than anything else. Islamist parties are the problem, whether they are smart or not. And I think we need to deal with this problem straightforward, in a straightforward way, because without solving this kind of problem, we are not going to make any progress in our society. When we solve it, we will be able to deal with secularism and other things. But first, we have to deal with Islamic problem that we do have. We have to face it, and we have to reach the realities of this. Thank you.
Thank you. I prefer to start. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mustafa. I'm from the Barzani Foundation. I'm here with my colleague. Actually, I come from an Iraqi Kurdistan region, who most of you know the issue is very obvious, so I don't really have to go to the history of the issue. My opinion about the democracy and secularism, actually, neither of them cannot work without not upholding the human rights. For example, the oldest secularism regime in the region, I would say Turkey. From the end of the World War I, the Kemal Atatürk obviously founded Turkey based on the secularism. However, this is our own experience. This doesn't really reflect the reality of the region or the country. But for many, many years, even though the Turkey was very secular, but the human right and the right of the Kurd in Turkey was actually violated by the secular system, even though after that the many coup d'etats happened. However, I'm not promoting Erdogan in any shape and form, but he came to power and he's supposed to be an Islamist in that way. Obviously, the situation for the Kurds is still the same. However, at least the Kurd has been recognized. There is a lot of discussion and initiative for peace has been in place as well as now. And if you're going back to the Iran, prior was a secular, then the Iranian regime, Islamic regime, came to power. There was the Islamists, Saddam, and Syria also they were secular. But the secularism doesn't really necessarily protect the right of everyone. We emphasize a lot about the extremism, Islamist or non-Islamist, in a sense where they are verses of the secularism. Of course they are, and there is very obvious. But either way, if you are secular or you are not conservative, you do not really, as you lady rightly mentioned, you don't really consider the right of every citizen of your country, regardless of their ethnic background. I don't think the democracy really have any meaning whatsoever. So my question is really to whoever the answer is can we call democracy in a, let's say, Middle Eastern region without having a proper institution and then a monitoring to evaluate the human right in the country? For example, in Iraq, we have a regime, it's not a secular, but a democratic. In Syria, it could be both. In Tunisia is the best example, but the Tunisian problem is very different. The mentality of the people, the civilization of Tunisia probably have very different from the Middle East. There are two examples you mentioned rightly, Palestine and Israel and Kurd in Iraq, I would say another country as well. The regime are supposed to be seculars in most cases. Also, they call them democracy, but there is no democracy. In Kurdistan region, and that's my last point, in Kurdistan region, which is a Kurdish part of Iraq, now there is obviously a protection of minorities, of the Christian, Kafir, Jew, and everyone else, which have really helped the people to stay and not to migrate further to other countries. But I mean, the one small region in the entire Islamic world, I don't think can make really any impact, because the majority of the country's constitution, if not necessarily written, but in reality is based on the Islamic interpretation of the society. I think that's the problem. I think first, other than just being thinking about the secularism, I think you have to also think about the multi-ethnic background of the region, if you will take the Middle East as an example. And when you give the right to everyone equally within a country, not necessarily has to be a separation or has to be a separate country, I think then you can call it a democracy, and then this can be really a best fight against the Islamist organization or Islamist agendas, who they have a very specific, very isolated, and very brutal agenda for the society. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm a little afraid of going far afield if I answer your question, because, look, Hina mentioned the madrasas that America backed in Pakistan. And if you don't know this, you might be surprised. But America pushed fundamentalist Islam all across the world because they thought it'll help fight the Soviet Union, which is atheist. So then they turned around and said, I can't believe how fundamentalist you are. Now we have this issue of that all of you are pointing at, which is that the Muslim party, same thing happens in America with the folks who are more fundamentalist Christian, right? We're the true Christians. We're the true Muslims. And so we have to get past that and discuss what does it mean. And I appreciate your point. It's also Kurds and Turks are both Sunni Muslims, so it doesn't really affect the fact that Kurds' rights could still be taken away, even if it's the same religion. But I want to get one more. Yes.
Thank you. I think it's very important, and this all boils down to our use of words and their meanings in terms and terminology. I say that because I was the first Muslim woman in Scottish history ever elected to the House of Commons. And one of the first things I had to do was to educate members of the House of Commons not to use the word ISIS, because there's no such thing as an Islamic State, but to use the word Daesh, which was very important in that context. And also to have a debate around, which I did in the House of Commons, around hijab. And actually framing it that it's about the right of women to wear what they wish, without anyone telling them what they can wear. And sometimes when you explain things and contextualize them, you can bring on board many people who might otherwise have an adverse view of what you're trying to say. So I think lazy journalism, and frankly politicians who are lazy in their use of terminology, have a lot to answer for. And all of us who have a platform should be very clear about what words mean. Because if we don't use them correctly, people can face threats on their lives and all sorts of other things that face women in politics.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, India came up a lot in discussion, so I want to add a little bit of perspective here. India, even though has been born as a secular country, we did not have the word secular in our constitution until 20 years into our independence. It was added into our preamble during a period of emergency by the first female Prime Minister of India, who was then gunned down due to sectarian conflict. So the word secular has never been not dirty. It has been dirty, and the floodgates of it have been opened in India even more now. And I want to ask a more fundamental question of if secularism is still relevant, because we've limited it to just talk about religion, and we've not extended it to talk about sectarian conflict or regional conflict. Whether we talk about whichever religion you take, there is always sectarian differences. Hindus have their caste systems in Shaivites and Vaishnavites. Muslims have their own problems with Ahmadiyyas, Rohingyas, Kurds, whichever populations you talk about. And and Christians have the same when you go to Catholic or Protestant majority countries. So how is secularism still relevant if we just stop it at religion, and if we do not extend it and not include the diversity within religions, because none of these are monolithic concepts?
Would it help if instead of calling it secularism, which is amazing to get this international perspective. That's why I really love what we're doing here, because in America, secularism is not necessarily a dirty word at all. And so I didn't even realize it was a dirty word in a lot of parts of the world. Would it help if we called it freedom of religion?
let me be a little bit provocative. Forget about the word secularist. You won't lose anything if you say, I am Democrat. That's really, I think it's enough. Because once again, when we talk about secularism, it means that we are against something, and we are against something which is religion. And so we are trapped in this conflict. We have to get rid of this conflict. We have to say, look, I'm not interested in this divided. I am no more interested to say, this man is secularist, this man. You talk about Iraq. You remember that we have had the worst, probably one of the worst dictatorship in the world, and this was a secular dictatorship. Do you agree? In Syria also, they used to have the worst dictatorship, and it was secularist. So really, if we can get rid of this divide, it would be very good for all of us, because we wouldn't have to explain all the time that we are not against religion. We are not against religion. I don't give a damn about religion. For me, democracy is the most important thing, and we can do everything with this word democracy. And the divide should be between anti-democrats and people for supporting democracy and the human rights. Really, if we can get rid of this word, we would be really free of burden. This is my opinion.
I don't think secular values can ever become irrelevant, because they support the ability of democracies to deliver and to be able to fulfill the expectations of democracy. Secondly, you asked whether it's better to say freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is fine, but if you, as I have just said in my presentation, if you ally the state with one particular religion, then you're always giving that religion an idea that you are the primary citizen. The other ones are not primary citizens. And I'll tell you, in my country, for instance, there's so much contradiction in the constitution itself. On the one hand, this is a country that has ratified the ICCPR. This is a country that in its constitution has complete fundamental freedoms guaranteed, including the freedom of religion. And yet, we have instances where non-Muslims are not treated at par with the Muslim citizens. So let me say at the end, democracy is not rule of the majority. If anyone thinks that, they're absolutely wrong. Democracy comes with a package of values and principles. And if you are not adhering to those principles, it's a void democracy.
Yeah. I'm going to... Yeah, of course.
Just one word, because, I always hear people talking about democracy and human rights. In fact, democracy is part of human rights. The package of human rights is, Article 1, right to life, to freedom, to dignity, etc., etc. And democracy is just Article 19, Article 20, Article 21 of the Human Rights Declaration. Democracy is part of human rights. So if you say I'm a human rights activist and I'm Democrat, it's enough, because you have everything you would like to put under the word secularist. This is my opinion.
Yeah. Again, I'll double down on one thing on words, and then I'll take one more question. When we say Islamist, I'm afraid that it triggers in people's minds Islam rather than the ist, right?
Yes.
And so, for example, if you say the real problem is fundamentalism, then you could say to Palestinians, well, you don't like Jewish fundamentalism in the West Bank, right? So we're against fundamentalism. And do we like Islam? Well, of course we do. We're Muslims, right? But do we like fundamentalist Islam? No, because the problem is with fundamentalism, not with Islam, right? So if you separate it into two words, you could make fundamentalism the ugly word instead of secularism, right? And to me, it is. If somebody says they're a fundamentalist, I think that's the ugliest word there is. And that means you shut off your mind and you're not thinking and you're just regurgitating something that a religious leader told you for his own interest. Yeah. Okay, yes.
Hi, thank you all for the interesting debate, and Mr. Uygur, it's nice to see you.
Thank you.
I've been seeing you long time on TV. So I just want to add something. And based on the secularism is a concept in this bunch of philosophies and categories developed through the European Christian experience. So in other parts of the world like Islam and Jewish and Hindus and whatever there is in the rest of the world, they might not share that particular experience. So the modern understanding of secularism, I don't believe and I don't think it might be helpful to generalize it and to try to include all other religions and all other communities in this debate. But it was pretty interesting to talk about that. And secondly, I'm coming from a country where the constitution says only Muslims can be citizens.
Yes.
Yes, the Maldives.
Maldives, yes.
Yeah, the Maldives. Only Muslims can be.
And Sunni Muslims.
Generally said Muslims, but for to be the president, to be Sunni Muslim. A professor at Qatar University of Political Science looked into our constitution just because of this section of the constitution. And he decided it's not an Islamic constitution just because of this particular section of our constitution. Why? Because of religious freedom. Because our constitution was developed and many others around the world through some experience, not necessarily based on the objective principles of sacred or whatever it is. Mostly, probably 70% of our what we see in letters mostly are based on the experiences, not necessarily on sacred principles. So that's one point I have to make, and I would like to hear from you about this. Thank you.
I totally agree with you.
Okay, we have one total agreement.
No, I don't totally agree with you. I think that there are still problems in the Maldives because of the nature of the constitution and how it defines the relationship between the state and citizens who can only be Muslims. And this kind of problem has to be resolved. In many ways, I agree with you, Cenk, in some ways, that this has to be a problem that has to be resolved. The right terminology is important. The recognition that nothing is irrelevant. Yeah. It's how you use terminology and put it into practice in order to make sure that all fundamental freedoms and human rights are in reality enjoyed and people are enabled to enjoy them. So here what stands in the way is not just fundamentalism. I would say all kinds of extremist ideologies, whether they are political or religious. So my aversion is not just to what we call fundamentalism. My aversion is to extremism. And extremism put into practice in order to create that polarization and division, to promote communalism, to promote disharmony in the population. Because let us look at what the world is today. Most of the conflicts are not wars between states. It's internal conflicts based on lack of acceptance of diversity. So these are some of the things that I think we are all compelled to think about. Who has the answer and the right way of going about it? I still can't say. We all have our own ideas. But the experiences that we have had of, say, extremism adopted by the state and fanned public opinion because of that extremism that in somehow serves a certain political agenda, that is the problem that is the historical learning that has given us this idea that things have to be changed.
Okay, last one.
So I'm from Australia, which is a secular country, but I did just want to put in a pitch to point out the comment that the President made about democracy being one of many rights, because notwithstanding the fact there's no restriction on practicing religion or any component of citizenship that requires a certain form of religion, there are ways in which religion does influence the provision, for example, of public services that can be done in a way that is under the protection of freedom of religion but has severe consequences for people trying to exercise their rights. So I'm talking about things like religious-based education which permits, for example, discrimination on the basis of sexuality for teaching roles, for example, the provision of healthcare, so women accessing abortion through state-funded hospitals that are run by religious institutions and denied sometimes in, what could be considered life-saving care, but also the freedom to be able to access healthcare in a secular setting. So I do think there is an argument that democracy can seal other forms of discrimination that can occur through practicing of religion in the provision of public services or the capabilities created by the state to give people the right to exercise other rights. So democracy is one right among many rights, and I think if we have to think about, I would make an argument that we need to broaden the frame beyond just saying voting is the primary mechanism through which people exercise their rights. In fact, there are many rights listed in the Universal Declaration, and religion, freedom of religion is one of them, but we have to balance how that may be exercised against a range of other rights. And the state has a responsibility to do that, I think, in an open and a secular manner, which is not something that I think liberal democracies necessarily always do well, and then I think we have to be careful about assuming we set some great example for other democracies and otherwise that might be struggling with these problems as well.
Let me just catch on to one thing that you just said. I don't agree with everything you said, but at the same time, I think this religious education problem is something we are all experiencing as part of some of those occurrences that are distressful. For instance, in my country, there is this single national curriculum that your friend Mr. Imran Khan introduced.
My friend.
And this single national curriculum imposes the compulsion on non-Muslims to study Islam. Not as a subject of Islamiyat, that's a separate thing, and they say, okay, only Muslims will study Islamiyat. But in English, in Urdu, in geography, they are teaching Islamiyat. And we are in court right now, challenging that curriculum, because the Supreme Court has the power to say that, this is against the constitutional guarantee of freedom of religion. So these are some of the things that give us this idea of what we have to fight against.
Yeah. So, when we talk about is democracy the umbrella or is human rights the umbrella, what we've discovered today in all of this discussion is that Noam Chomsky was right. It's all about language.
Yes.
Right? And so I love the conversation we had here all together, and thank you for coming out and for being part of this community of people who care about doing right things in the world, but most especially to Hina Jilani and President Marzouki. Thank you for not just having a theoretical conversation as the most of us are, but actually having lived it and fought for the right principles, and for sharing that today. Thank you.
Thank you.